Thank you for being here tonight for our program sponsored by Metro West Climate Solutions Group. I'm Jeff Barsnell. I'm a Weston resident, and I'm a member of the steering committee for Metro West Climate Solutions and your moderator for tonight's program, along with Joel Angelillo. Metro West Climate Solutions, or MWCS, is a local partnership of organizations and congregations, including First Parish in Wayland, First Parish Church in Weston, First Parish in Lincoln, First Parish in Framingham, Energize Wayland, Sustainable Weston Action Group, and a growing list of communities and individuals here in the Metro West area. I should note that our organization is entirely volunteer run and led, and we do not accept donations from for-profit companies or lobbying groups. Our mission is to encourage and inspire sustainable, resilient, and equitable communities in our region, and to host timely programs and discussions that encourage people and organizations to get involved in taking the steps necessary to move our region and country towards a low or no carbon and sustainable future. More information can be found at our website, metrowestclimatesolutions.org. There you will find recordings of many of our past programs and information on our upcoming events. You can also sign up for our email announcements. I should also say we are delighted tonight to have two co-sponsors for this evening's program, the Lincoln Green Energy Committee and Green Newton. It is satisfying to see a growing network of local and regional environmental groups come together to support the development of offshore wind off of New England's coasts. Tonight's program grew out of our dismay in reading about the latest legal and regulatory roadblocks that have been erected by our federal government to slow down and even prevent major offshore wind projects. Since January, the new administration has issued a series of executive orders and actions, including one to stop issuing permits to wind projects under development. The president signed a bill into law that eliminates important tax credits for wind developers and handed down several stop work orders to prevent wind projects already under construction, though some were reversed and overturned. What's particularly remarkable and dismaying and puzzling about all this is that these roadblocks are being put in place at a time when wind and solar energy have become some of the least expensive and easiest to develop forms of power generation available, both here and around the world. Last year, wind and solar power accounted for 16% of our country's electricity, and they are growing fast. Ironically, the states where wind is growing the fastest are places like Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, areas not exactly known for their liberal politics. The economics of wind are simply that compelling. Now, a growing number of citizens here in New England are supporting the development of wind power, but not on our land. We don't have a lot of land here in New England, but out in the water, offshore. Some of us believe that the answer to our future energy problems and needs is literally blowing in the wind, especially during the late fall and winter months when solar cannot provide a lot of our power, and wind generation can help New England decarbonize our grid and economy, even on a cold January night. We don't need just one offshore wind farm. We actually need 25 to 30, perhaps more. We're going to hear about the importance of wind to our current and future economy from Zach First, the commercial director for Vineyard Offshore. Vineyard Offshore is the developer of the Vineyard Wind Project, which is about 15 miles south of Martha's Vineyard. Unlike other offshore wind projects, Vineyard Wind is already a reality. It has steel in the water, with half of its 62 wind turbines already installed and online, and my understanding is they're producing power. The remainder are being installed or are brought online, weather permitting, over the next 3 to 4 months. This means that Vineyard Wind is now, I believe, that Zach will tell us, the largest operating offshore wind farm in the United States, at least for the time being. And they are just one of several wind projects that are underway. Zach is going to speak for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, we ask that you use the Q&A button, or it's with a little question mark in it on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be monitoring that the questions that come through there and not through the comment section. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can tonight. We recognize there has been considerable debate and some strong feelings expressed about offshore wind projects here in New England. We ask all those participating this evening to be respectful. We also wish to state here at the outset that all of us participating in tonight's program are doing so on a volunteer basis. None of us is being paid, and that this organization supports the development of offshore wind projects here in New England. And now we welcome Mr. Zach First. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jeff. Very happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to speak. This is obviously a subject that is very close to my heart and the center of my professional life. I'm just going to share my screen now and get the slides up in front of us. How does that look? It's good. Well, yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you for that introduction, Jeff. So like you said, my name is Zach First, and I'm a commercial director at Vineyard Offshore. The title of my talk this evening is Offshore Wind Energy Overcoming Federal Headwinds. And there's a pun in there, but also I recognize that headwinds is what we're cheering for when we build an offshore wind farm. We want wind coming our direction. But tonight I'll have a chance to give you a little bit of a introduction to who we are, our project areas, where we're proposing to develop offshore wind, and then I'll speak a little bit about our construction project, Vineyard Wind 1. Then I'll speak generally about offshore wind, what it is, how it's built, why we build wind farms offshore rather than onshore, and then get into a little bit about, what's the business case and why are we building offshore wind, and what is the unique value proposition it brings relative to other energy sources and other renewables specifically. And then finally, I'll go into the challenges that Jeff alluded to in his opening that we've had this year with the Trump administration, some of the policy actions that have slowed us down, tripped us up, and what does that mean for us, and what does that mean for the U.S. economy, for our climate goals? And then I'll end on a positive note, because there is reason for optimism, and talk a little bit about where the industry is heading, even in these challenging circumstances. I should mention I'm a Metro West resident, along many of you. I live in Natick with my wife and two kids. So very happy to be here and to share with you about offshore wind, and I'll do my best to answer questions as they come along, if it makes sense to do so. Otherwise, happy to stay at the end until everyone gets to have their questions answered. So Vineyard Offshore, I should start by mentioning our investor, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. CIP was founded in 2012 by a group of executives from another famous offshore wind development company called Ørsted. CIP is the world's largest renewables investment fund manager. We manage 12 funds now globally. Each of those funds invests in either a different asset class of renewable technology or a different set of geographical markets. And we have over 30 billion in assets under management to date. CIP is growing and raising new funds with a goal to deploy 100 billion by 2030. And as I mentioned, investing across all renewable asset classes except nuclear. Offshore wind makes up about a third of our portfolio of what we do, and we're investing in projects and building projects on 6 continents. So we have a very wide global impact in the renewable space. Vineyard Offshore is CIP's wholly owned exclusive offshore wind development arm in North America. So you can read that to mean that we develop all offshore wind farms that are invested in by CIP in North America. And we were set up in April of 2022. I joined the company in 2021, just as we had reached financial close on our Vineyard Wind 1 project, about which we'll speak a little bit tonight. And then we had gathered a portfolio of seabed assets that we plan to develop in the coming years. And that was really the genesis of Vineyard Offshore. We're the development team behind Vineyard Wind 1, which is a joint venture with Avangrid, and I'll speak a little bit more to that. And our portfolio consists of 3 different lease areas aside from Vineyard Wind 1 off the coast of Massachusetts, New York, and California. And all in all, including Vineyard Wind 1, that's about 6 gigawatts of potential. So a really big development portfolio of offshore wind projects that we're moving ahead. This makes more sense to talk about in front of a map. So what you see here are the lease areas to which CIP has rights. So if you start on the right side of your screen or east, we have New England and New York. You see Vineyard Wind 1 there in the upper right, so due south of Martha's Vineyard. That project is an 800 megawatt project with fixed bottom foundations, and I'll speak a little bit about what fixed bottom foundation means. And that's the project that's currently under construction, targeting to be completed by end of this year or very early next year. Further to the southeast, you see what we've titled here Vineyard Wind 2. So that's a lease area that could build out offshore wind farms that would be triple the capacity of Vineyard Wind 1. So a very big lease area indeed, with about 2.4 gigawatts of potential, also fixed bottom, although in deeper waters and further offshore. And then in the down to the southwest there, south of Long Island, you see our Excelsior Wind project, which is one that I was part of the team that secured this lease area back in January of 2022. This is a 1.3 gigawatt fixed bottom project that we have bid into New York and actually have an active bid into New York to sell the power from this project and to build it. And then finally, on the West Coast, we secured a lease area in the first floating auction for floating offshore wind in December of 2022. This is off Northern California, so closest city onshore would be Eureka. And this is an area where the water is quite deep. It's about 1,000 meters, 3,000 feet. And but the wind resource is incredibly strong, and California has ambitious floating offshore wind targets. And I'll get into a little bit fixed and floating, the rationale for each, and where they make sense respectively. But this is our 6 gigawatt portfolio of construction and development projects. So I mentioned Vineyard Wind 1. So this is the first commercial scale, large scale offshore wind project in the country. It is 800 megawatts. It will power 400,000 homes in Massachusetts when it's completed. The area, as we mentioned, is 15 miles south of Martha's Vineyard, and we're currently under construction. So Vineyard Wind 1 is comprised of 62 turbines of 13 megawatts each. And we have most of those installed already, and we're in the commissioning process where now that they've been installed, they're being commissioned and tested and will be brought online. And we're already producing more than half the capacity of the project, so more than 400 megawatts, which already makes us one of the largest sources of energy in New England. You see the cable route passes up between Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and lands on Cape Cod. And you'll also see that in the upper left there, New Bedford is the port from which we are marshaling all of our turbines. So they get loaded onto barges in New Bedford and brought out for installation in the lease area. And then we have a operations and maintenance hub on Martha's Vineyard itself, where the staff of operations and maintenance workers stay, and where they get ready to bring out necessary equipment and tools to perform operations and maintenance on the wind farm. So Vineyard Wind 1 is a very large project, even by global standards, 800 megawatts. And it's had a huge impact on the communities in which it has a presence, creating thousands of jobs and also already offering huge energy cost savings for ratepayers through its production during the times of year and times of day when we don't have as good or as cost-effective of alternatives. So that's a little bit about Vineyard Wind 1. I think this diagram is helpful because I think when folks imagine offshore wind farm, they imagine an onshore wind farm in the ocean, and that's not entirely wrong, but there's a lot of components that go into this technology. These are big infrastructure projects. They're like highways or dams or nuclear power plants in the sense that they're multi-billion-dollar investments. The wind farm and all of the turbines and foundations that are installed offshore, each of those has a cable connected to it that brings the power to an offshore substation, or what's labeled here, the electrical service platform. So you can imagine out of 62 turbines at Vineyard Wind 1, five to seven turbines will all be linked up by a single cable, and that will bring the power at about 66 kilovolts to the offshore platform, at which point the power is increased in voltage and then transported via an export cable to shore. And that's brought up in voltage in order to reduce the losses along that cable route. I mentioned that the foundations on which the wind turbines are installed are fixed bottom. So that means we are connected to the seafloor. So we actually have monopiles that are pushed into the seabed, and that is on which the wind turbines are installed. And then once we bring our cable eventually to the onshore portion, the cable takes the power to an onshore substation, where it is then incorporated into the ISO New England grid. The installation of an offshore wind farm involves a number of specialty vessels. So what's depicted there on the far right, that's what we call a jackup vessel. So a large vessel with a crane on board with legs that actually prop the ship up out of the water such that it has a stable installation base. And that is the platform from which we're able to gather components off of barges, lift them into position, and install them. There's obviously cable installation vessels, as well as vessels bringing out foundations and the electrical service platform itself. I have a few questions here just to sort of frame the discussion around the technology. So offshore wind versus onshore wind. I think the first thing to highlight is scale. Offshore wind farms, so the total farm that we're building of 800 megawatts is much, much bigger than what you can build onshore, specifically because of land constraints. There aren't contiguous onshore wind farms that have this type of capacity that can be built out, and it's much more challenging to permit a many different parcel of land onshore wind farm than it is a single parcel of seabed to develop an offshore wind farm. So that's one piece of the scale of the projects, but the scale of the technology as well. These wind turbines that we have offshore are up to 15 megawatts each today. That's in comparison to the largest onshore wind farms that we have today. The wind turbines onshore are generally up to 5 megawatts. So you can have 3 times as large a wind turbine generator each. So you're able to reach that scale of 800 megawatts with a lot fewer positions than you would in an onshore wind farm. All of offshore wind turbine components and foundation components are generally manufactured on a seaside or a riverside manufacturing facility so that they can be directly transported by vessel. That is not the case with onshore wind, of course, where you're trucking components over land by truck or by train. So offshore wind, by nature of that supply chain, is able to produce much larger wind turbines, and these are growing daily. The hub where the 3 blades come out from it, that's approximately 150 meters in the air, and the diameter of the swept area that those blades are making is bigger than a football field. So these are massive structures that we're building. Floating versus offshore wind, or floating versus fixed bottom wind. I mentioned our California lease area. There are parts of the world where the wind resource is very, very strong, and you have coastal load centers where you would love to have a source of power coming from somewhere that's not inland. But the water depth does not allow you to be able to put piles into the seabed. And floating offshore wind is the concept that you can have an actual floating platform on which a turbine is installed and have a similar collection of these array cables to an electric service platform which could be floating, and bring those cables to shore. And as soon as you're able to go into that floating regime, which is generally deeper than 60 meters of water, we see a lot more potential globally for offshore wind build out. So today we're still sort of in the low-hanging fruit stage, where we're seeking projects where the water depths are 30 to 40 meters or 90 to 120 feet. And in the future, the expectation is floating offshore wind will become more economical, much as fixed bottom has, as the cost curves have come down as we reach economies of scale, such that it makes sense to build floating offshore wind farms as well. Those are on a different timeline than onshore than fixed bottom offshore wind. There's projects now in the US portfolio which are going to be coming online this year, like Vineyard Wind 1 in 2026. But most of the fixed bottom projects, which are in development stage, are now likely to come online in the 2030s. Floating offshore wind is likely to come even later than that, in the second half of the 2030s or the 2040s. And then here, a general concept about question around, offshore wind. Why build this stuff? Why do something so challenging and complex in the offshore area? And I think it comes down to really these 5 factors. So I've talked about the scale, that's the size, the ability to build out a huge amount of renewable energy in a single project. The second is the location. It makes a lot of sense to have offshore wind in places where you have big load centers with constrained transmission to them onshore, or constraints on the ability to build out other forms of energy on land. So that's particularly the case in New England, where you don't have as much available land to build out solar and onshore wind. And so the ability to bring power from offshore to the load centers makes a lot of sense. What I'm calling timing here is that offshore wind relative to onshore renewables is most productive during the times of day when onshore renewables are less productive. So think in the evening when solar starts to drop off, onshore wind is still stronger than it is during the midday, but not enough to make up for that solar generation, which you don't get at night. And offshore wind is very productive in the nighttime hours. From a seasonality standpoint, it's again the same trend, that in times of year when solar is less productive, namely the winter months, offshore wind is producing at full bore. And that is a huge part of the commercial business case behind offshore wind, that we're able to produce electricity at the times of year when we're really constrained onshore and have a lot of electrical needs, heating needs. And then finally, economic development. Offshore wind taps into coastline infrastructure that in many parts of the US has been either abandoned or requires revitalization. And so offshore wind allows us to redevelop our ports, leverage our strong marine workforce, and to also use our electrical infrastructure that's been built out for legacy fossil fuel generation. Think, coal plants that are on major waterways or on the shore for cooling purposes, so they have access to water. And our grid has been built around those legacy forms of fossil fuel generation. So it makes all the sense in the world that offshore wind brings cables ashore and plugs in at those same parts of the grid. So there's a lot of efficiencies that can be gained. Furthermore, on economic development, these are massive projects that have a huge economic development potential, creating good paying jobs for people in civil works. So there are a lot of strong workforce opportunities for union members. There's obviously a lot of indirect job creation in the communities where we have our port facilities, and we have the entire offshore wind or the offshore workforce as well. So all in all, major economic development boons to the regions in which we have offshore wind. I'd like to talk now a little bit about the normal schedule for an offshore wind project. What does it look like from start to finish? So the first thing is lease acquisition. In the U.S., this is done at the federal level. So the entity that auctions off seabed for offshore wind development is called BOEM. So that's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and it falls under the Department of the Interior. And BOEM engages in multi-year processes to identify the highest potential places for offshore wind development, engaging with fisheries, with shipping, with local First Nations, federally recognized tribes, with other ocean users to identify where there might be potential conflicts and to identify areas that will offer the least conflict and the least impact to those industries or those ocean users, while also balancing that with the areas for the highest production potential. So where is the wind the best? Where is the water the most shallow? What is closest to port infrastructure, grid infrastructure, and load centers where the power is going to be consumed. So through that multi-year process, BOEM then eventually decides to have an auction, and you bid for leases. And this is a competitive process in which you bid a monetary value, and it's an ascending clock, which over a number of rounds, results in one winner per lease area. And there's been several of these held. Quite a few of them were held during the Biden administration. And that's the process by which you secure seabed through a competitive auction process. Once you have your seabed, then it's time to develop the project. And the first thing to do is start taking surveys. So there are a few different major types of surveys. One is wind resource. So we deploy something called a FLIDAR, which measures the wind resource within the lease area that you've acquired. And you also have geotechnical and geophysical surveys of the seafloor. So we're looking for, what does the substrate layers look like? Are there obstacles on the seabed that we wouldn't want to interfere with? Are there archaeological finds that we wouldn't want to interfere with? Are there unexploded ordinances from a past military operation or training area? All of these surveys in order to ensure that when we go to install, that happens smoothly and responsibly. Once we've collected all that data, we start using it to inform our technical design. So what will this project look like? How many turbines? What size of turbine? What ports? What's our cable route? What route will that cable take to ensure that it's least impact? And that's how we mature the project using that data. Then using sort of that preliminary view of what the offshore wind farm might look like, then we put together a business case and we say, this is what the project will cost to build from a development standpoint. So when we go get our permits, from a construction standpoint, when we're actually buying and installing the equipment, and then the operational period, what will be our revenue from producing offshore wind at this site. And we compete in competitive solicitations in the states in which we operate. So this is for offtake or for power purchase agreements, PPAs. And we have competed in New England and in New York previously. And that is done at the state level. So a clear distinction to be made between the federal auction of seabed, which is in the offshore, the outer continental shelf, and the actual purchasing of power, which happens through contracting at the state level. Those two things are quite different, and it's not the case that those two processes are separate in other markets. In some markets in Europe, you're actually bidding at the same time for the seabed as well as the contract. Once we have made these bids and we've been awarded on the basis of our price and our project's development, its viability, how much economic development it's going to catalyze in the communities in which we will operate, we then have to negotiate and sign a PPA. So in New England, we do that with the EDCs, the electrical distribution companies, which are Eversource, Unitil, and National Grid. In New York, we do this actually directly with a public-private entity called NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. They are the ones who actually contract for offshore wind, not the utilities in New York. And once we have executed a PPA, then we're able to go to the next phase and really mature the engineering design. So, who will be our suppliers of turbines? Who will be our suppliers of foundations, of cable, of substation, of vessels to install all of this equipment? And we start that contracting process. At this point, once we have secured our offtake contract, our PPA, our federal permits, which we need to apply for using the geophysical and geotechnical and wind resource data that I discussed previously, our state permits for the portion of our project that lands onshore and goes through state waters, and we've signed the contracts for our supply chain equipment and CapEx. And we've also signed our interconnection agreement that we're allowed to plug into the grid. Once we have those 5 things, then the project can become real in the sense that we reach something called financial close. Financial close is the event at which we raise debt financing, which allows us to build the project. And that's an important milestone, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Once we've reached financial close, we can start manufacturing. So components are manufactured at facilities in Europe, in Asia, some increasingly so in the US. The components are brought here and staged at ports for installation. Then we have the installation campaign, and I'll have more pictures later on of what happens offshore when we go to install all of this equipment and we commission the turbines and all the electrical equipment. Then we enter operations and maintenance. So after this long period of approximately 5 years of development, applying for permits, doing the technical design, reaching financial close, constructing over 3 to 4 years, some of that onshore, some of that offshore, then we can actually enter commercial operation and produce. And the lifetime of an offshore wind farm can be up to 35 years. At the end of those 35 years, then it's our responsibility to decommission and to remove the wind farm that has been installed there. So that's an important thing to note, that we set aside finances at the beginning of the process for developing offshore wind, such that we have that money ready to fund the removal and decommissioning of offshore wind projects in the future. So that was a little bit about sort of the technical and sort of schedule parameters of offshore wind. And now I want to go back to what I went into a little bit before, which is the case for offshore wind. So this is clean energy, right? This is non-emitting. It can be built out at scale, close to our load centers, and it complements our onshore resources very well, while at the same time spurring a lot of economic development. I mentioned the wind resource being strong and consistent offshore, which allows us to operate at a higher capacity factor. A capacity factor is if you take all the hours in the year and you say, okay, which of those hours were we operating at 400 megawatts or 600 megawatts or 200 megawatts out of a total potential of 800, that percentage of total megawatt hours produced versus total potential of megawatt hours that we could with the full build out of our wind farm, that's the capacity factor. Onshore wind generally has capacity factors in the 20s and 30%, 25, 30%. Offshore wind generally has much higher capacity factors because of the wind resource being stronger, of 40 to 50%. I mentioned previously, offshore wind is most productive at night, at times when solar is less available. And then I think one thing I'll discuss more here is a little bit about how that complementarity with solar and onshore wind can drive grid reliability and reduce our exposure as New Englanders to winter natural gas price spikes. Yeah, so that brings me to affordability. So offshore wind on its face is not the least cost energy resource out there. That's a fact, and that's not something we shirk away from. The levelized cost of energy for solar is lower than offshore wind. However, offshore wind produces, as I've mentioned, at times of year when we are most strained for energy resources. Currently, we're still quite dependent on fossil fuels in New England, as Jeff alluded to. We spend $76 billion a year on energy, and most of that is on imported natural gas. During cold winter times, prices spike incredibly high, and the opportunity to displace natural gas generation during those times of year when prices are very high, and they're high because everybody is heating their homes, is a real value proposition. When we contract for offshore wind, we have fixed prices. So the price that we agree today for a project that we're going to build in 2 to 3 years, and then it's going to come online, say, in 5 or 6 years, that price that we agree today starts in 2030. So if you've read headlines and said, there were offshore wind bids that were submitted and this was the average price, it's very important to note that that price does not hit bills until 2030. If you read in the media or you listen to our president, for example, he'll say, offshore wind is driving up prices. There's no offshore wind on the grid. We're not producing, right? There's a couple of small scale offshore wind farms, and Vineyard Wind 1 is starting to get under construction, but that's not a possibility because the resource is not there yet. We're just getting this industry off the ground. If we had offshore wind earlier and at larger scale, it would have been possible to lower our bills in New England by 11% wholesale prices. And over the 3 months of winter, we would have saved New England customers $400 million. You see a similar trade in Connecticut. Connecticut is also an active offshore wind procuring state. They expected that they would have saved, that they will save $500 million in wholesale market savings by 2028. And long term, if you take the lifetime of Vineyard Wind 1, we expect that we will save New England customers up to $3.7 billion from this very factor that we're able to produce and displace natural gas generation at times of year when it's in high demand and prices are very, very high. So we also need to think about reliability and keeping the lights on. And offshore wind is part of the strategy that our ISO, our independent service operator, system operator, has been planning for. So we expect that electricity demand in New England, just like everywhere else in the country, is going to spike. So we're expecting the demand nationally to increase by up to 16% by 2029. One of the very hot topics, of course, is AI and the build out of data centers and their need for power and cheap power. They're going to put a strain on our grid, absolutely. And we're expecting that strain to impact us here in New England. And as we electrify our economy, we're going to have higher electrical demand in the winter time, which is well suited for offshore wind. And we're going to need to be able to meet that demand. Offshore wind will diversify the grid and add new generation capacity that is much needed. We really need an all-the-above approach, not only in New England, but nationally, in order to meet our economies and our reliability needs. ISO New England has been outspoken on this, which is quite unusual. As a apolitical agency, they have warned that offshore wind not being part of the resource mix is going to increase costs and could jeopardize our ability to keep the lights on, particularly in wintertime. Offshore wind, obviously, as an industry, we're building big projects, and of course, being renewable energy, our goal is to decarbonize the economy and fight climate change. So I mentioned we're a non-emitting resource. Over our lifetime, per kilowatt hour we produce, we're really only putting out 11 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, whereas you see the numbers for coal and for natural gas are orders of magnitude higher, 980 grams or 465 grams. Most of the carbon intensivity that comes from offshore wind is from the actual components which we install: steel, copper, cables, and the installation of all the components. If you follow offshore wind, you've probably read more than one article around wildlife, particularly marine mammal wildlife protection in offshore wind. We are incredibly limited in the times of year and the areas in which we can install, depending on the presence and the historical presence of marine mammals such as whales. So when we're installing turbines, specifically putting foundations into the seafloor, we have scouter vessels that are out there looking for whales that may be in the proximity. We're listening for the whales through acoustic monitoring. We have a technology called bubble curtains, which you see shown here in this picture. Those two rings of bubbles that are surrounding the vessel there, those are by design. So there is a perforated tube laid on the seabed floor around the area in which you're installing a monopile. And that perforated tube releases air bubbles and forms effectively a curtain around the area in which you're installing a monopile, such that when there is sound produced by pushing that monopile into the floor, it hits that ring of bubbles and dissipates. So we're able to significantly reduce the acoustic signature of the installation that we're doing when we're putting these monopiles into the seabed floor. Despite what has been said by our president and some of his allies, there's no link to whale deaths from offshore wind. Whales are killed by ship strikes, which are what drive our economy, container ships. But there is no evidence to say that whales are negatively impacted by offshore wind farms in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world, for that matter. I touched on economic development a little bit earlier. So we obviously have a big workforce development initiative. In order to build these wind farms, we need trained people who have the right skills to build and to maintain these wind farms. And part of the, I would say, very positive stories around offshore wind development is our relationship with fisheries. Fisheries and offshore wind, at the start of this industry, I think were quite skeptical of one another. And over time, we've built relationships founded on trust. And fisheries have actually seen quite a bit of economic developments tied to being contracted by us as the offshore wind developer to serve as security vessels, scout vessels, help us with transport of equipment. You see here, Vineyard Wind 1, we've awarded nearly 10 million in contracts to different fishermen to help them support our project. So now I'm going to shift gears. I've spoken a lot about what offshore wind can do and the reason why we build it, but there's some in our country who are not convinced of that, namely our president, and that's caused a lot of challenges for us in 2025. Almost immediately upon his inauguration, the president elected to issue a memorandum saying that no more offshore wind seabed would be leased, and all the projects that are applying for, in the process for applying for federal permits, would not be granted those permits, pending a review of offshore wind, which has not taken place and which we don't expect to take place. Frankly, it's been a clear sign that no new offshore wind projects will be granted federal permits under this administration. So our Vineyard Wind 1 project is fully permitted and under construction. So in that sense, that project is not impacted. But all of our development projects, the other 3 lease areas that I described, as well as all the lease areas of our competitors who have seabed in New England, New York, California, Carolina, all of those leases are unable to advance their federal permits, which are a necessary thing in order to reach your financial close and start building these projects. So we're facing quite a significant delay. In addition, what's maybe been most newsworthy has been the issuance of stop work orders on projects already under construction. So Empire Wind 1 is a project that's under construction off of Long Island and is contracted in New York. It's under development by Equinor, and that project was issued a stop work order while under construction. It's hard to overstate what a disaster such a stop work order is for these projects. I've mentioned they're multi-billion-dollar projects with many contracts for installation vessels that have massive liquidated damages that are owed to these vessel owners who are in very high demand globally if they're not able to work. So Empire Wind 1, once it was issued the stop work order, they actually made it quite public how much this was costing them. It was $50 million a week in delay costs. They were lucky in the sense that Equinor was able to get the support of Governor Hochul in New York to negotiate with the Trump administration, and that project was allowed to continue after about a month of being in a holding pattern. There's been other initiatives by the Trump administration to make it more challenging to permit wind and solar. So not just offshore wind here, but that the Secretary of the Interior his signature would be required in order for any of these major federal permits to be granted. So what we're talking about here is an appointed bureaucrat being given the power of the pen to say yes or no to any onshore wind, offshore wind, or solar project in America, if he chooses not to want to approve that project. And then most recently, there was another stop work order issued for Revolution Wind, and this is a project that's under development by Ørsted. The project was approximately 80% complete when it was halted, and that project had a similar burn rate of several tens of millions of delay fees every week that it was held back from being able to continue. Ultimately, they were not able to come to the sort of negotiating table with the Trump administration and filed litigation, and they were granted a preliminary injunction and allowed to continue, which was a major win for the industry. There is outstanding litigation on behalf of the states on the first bullet there, this presidential memorandum. 17 states in the District of Columbia have an open piece of litigation saying that this causes undue and irreparable harm to the wind projects that are seeking their permits, and we're still awaiting the decision on that litigation. So I mentioned, to summarize sort of what are the key impacts of changes in policy to the offshore wind projects that are under development. One is the federal permits. This is what we've been focused on here. Without a federal permit, we cannot finance the projects, we cannot build, and we cannot operate. So developers have had to slow and in some cases stop their development efforts, which has meant layoffs and the needing to cease business in some of the markets in which they operate. Others have actually been threatened with revocation of their permits by the Trump administration, those that already have a permit but maybe have not started construction. And there's a number of open legal cases on this front. The other thing is the investment tax credits. The one big beautiful bill that passed earlier this year did roll back some of the investment tax credits available to renewable energy. In particular, the phase out became sooner for most renewable sources. But in the case of offshore wind, there is actually a 10-year safe harbor provision, which we believe is still intact. But 2035 is actually not that far away if you consider we won't be able to finance any of these projects until a future administration comes into power. And then lastly, tariffs. This is not impacting development projects, but it is impacting projects under construction. Wind technology specifically has been targeted for heightened tariffs, which increases the costs of these projects and makes them more difficult to finance and to build. What does this mean for the US economy? I spoke a little bit earlier about the job creation on Vineyard Wind 1. These are good paying jobs for our union workforce, and these jobs are no longer being realized, and many of those people who have developed these very particular skill sets on offshore wind are not going to be able to translate those to the next round of projects because they're not happening or they're not moving ahead. And this is going to impact thousands of people across the East Coast of the United States. Infrastructure loss, I mentioned earlier, revitalizing port infrastructure and building out our grid, which is not only important for offshore wind, but for all of our electrical economy, our electrically driven economy, data centers and AI. That's no longer happening, which is a huge missed opportunity. There's obviously the energy loss. How can we say we're taking an all the above approach to trying to decarbonize our economy while meeting increasing demand, while responding to the advent of AI, we can't say we're doing all the above if we're not including offshore wind in that mix, particularly in regions like New England. And then investment loss, I think this one can't be overstated. What signal does it send globally to investors if a permit that has been earned over years of vetting and years of adherence to the federal government's process for issuing these permits can suddenly have those revoked on a dime, and then be faced with millions of dollars of damages every week until they're reinstated. I think this sends a really bad signal, not just for offshore wind investors, but for all investors in America, about what type of climate they're really putting their money into. And then lastly, climate goals, of course. How do we meet our climate targets without offshore wind? And I'll get into that a little bit on the next slide. But New England faces a unique set of challenges relative to other regions in the country. Hydroelectric imports from Quebec have been a cornerstone of our decarbonization over recent years. We have quite a few contracts to buy power from Hydro-Quebec. But what we're seeing now is Quebec has their own electrification path and their own need to keep those resources domestic. And they're also not producing on the same level that they once did because hydroelectric facilities are experiencing droughts in new ways that they haven't previously. So that's a direct impact of climate change. Given the advent of AI and data center electrical load growth, we're seeing natural gas and nuclear getting a lot of attention. So those are becoming increasingly expensive and long lead time and difficult to permit. We have to ask ourselves, is that what we want for New England to build out more natural gas and nuclear after years of trying to shift away? And then finally, the onshore renewables. In some parts of the country, it's easier to build out onshore renewables at scale, but it's more challenging in New England. And so including offshore wind in the portfolio is going to be the least cost option for us to meet our decarbonization targets. And that's something that's been evidenced by studies conducted by our own independent service system operator, ISO New England. They've looked at studies towards 2050. If we were to meet our climate targets, what would we need in terms of build out of different resources? So of the 77 gigawatts of new renewables that we would need between now and 2050, in addition to our existing resources, they looked at three different cases. A reference case where we build offshore wind as we had always done. A second where we look at increased offshore wind prices, which in large part is going to be driven by these delays and these additional hurdles that are now placed in our path. And a no offshore wind case. If we have to reach our targets without offshore wind, how will we do that? That will be very challenging. And what you see here is it's going to cost us $26 billion more in order to meet the same climate targets without offshore wind as part of the resource mix. However, I think there's reasons for optimism, and I don't want to let that slip by us. So, in spite of all these hurdles, the state level support remains strong. Massachusetts has been a leader on offshore wind. The other New England states have been leaders, New York in particular, and have ambitious goals to procure offshore wind. We see this as a delay and not a cancellation, and that the next few years will be challenging from a federal perspective, but we see a lot of support from the states to help us figure out how can we advance these projects absent federal support. And then I think, what's been made evident by the past few slides is the fundamentals that make offshore wind a good value proposition. Those have strengthened. They've not weakened. We see load growth from electrification, data centers, and AI. We see that our alternatives are becoming increasingly costly and less abundant. And so we're going to need offshore wind. And I think New York and Massachusetts and the other New England states really see that. And then we have construction projects that are moving ahead and really showing why it is that this resource makes so much sense for us to develop. So I'll quickly go through some of the construction projects that are underway today, which are fun pictures to look at and encouraging facts to read about. There's the Coastal Virginia offshore wind project in Virginia that is being built by Dominion Energy. This is a huge project. It's one of the largest globally when it's finished, 2.6 gigawatts or 2,600 megawatts. And they plan to be finished with this in 2026. And they have not had any delays as a result of the Trump administration. They had a Republican governor who was a big offshore wind proponent in Gavin Youngkin, and the new Democratic governor of Virginia is also a strong supporter. This wind farm will actually be installed by the first U.S. built wind turbine installation vessel, which is an exciting development for the domestic supply chain. Empire Wind, who I mentioned previously, that had the stop work order, they've completed installation of all their foundations and will install their turbines next year. This is an 800 megawatt project, so about the size of Vineyard Wind 1, that's being delivered into New York. Revolution Wind, another stop work order surviving project, 700 megawatt project that splits 400 megawatts to Connecticut, 300 to Rhode Island, is under construction and also planned for completion in 2026. Sunrise Wind, another Ørsted project into New York, 924 megawatts. This is probably one of the earlier stage construction projects. Only half the foundations are installed. And then finally here, you get to see some pictures that I've taken myself while out on a vessel at Vineyard Wind 1. So in the bottom right there, a video of one of our turbines already producing up close and personal. There on the left, me with the wind farm in the background, and then in the middle, you see the wind turbine installation vessel, the wind pace, which is about to install the wind turbine blades you see on the far left of the vessel. On top of that, what we call a hammerhead, which is the tower and then cell without the blades installed yet. And you see the vessel being jacked up there out of the water in order to have its steady construction base. That's what I have. I realize I'm a little bit over time now, but we'll be happy to take questions for as long as that takes. But thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you very much, Zach. That was an excellent presentation. Lots of really good information there. I do want to just quickly note, I mean, we're talking about gigawatts, megawatts in terms of capacity. And just to put it in perspective, you know, the size of these projects against the larger New England grid, like for tonight, let's see. Tonight, for example, ISO New England is using 19,540 megawatts or 19.5 gigawatts. So we would need roughly 22
Vineyard Wind ones, yes.
Vineyard ones to meet our needs this evening. So I assume
that's right.
Just available capacity. Currently, our capacity is somewhere around right now 16 gigawatts. But also just, I mean, right now renewables account for only 10% of our generation profile. So, so there's an opportunity here to increase drastically the amount of power that we are pulling from renewables with offshore wind in a way that would be a game changer for our economy and for our region, no doubt. We have a couple, we have several questions here, so I'm going to pose a few, and then we will, Joel will offer a few too. So you mentioned early on, Zach, about the installation of wind turbines and the foundations and the monopoles, and then you noted that the projects always hold back a certain amount of funds or capital for the decommissioning.
Yeah.
After 30 to 35 years. Dave asked, so what happens at the wind farm location after the decommissioning phase, after it's complete? And what happens with the actual structures during and after decommissioning? That's a question I had too. Would it be possible? I mean, obviously you have to replace the mechanical systems. Nacelles and gears don't last forever. Could you potentially repurpose or install new nacelles on top of the existing monopoles, provided that they're structurally sound? Or is there, I mean, does it depend on the agreement that you have?
Yeah, no, certainly. So that's a good that you bring up the agreement component. So the PPAs that are being offered by New York and New England are 20 to 25 years. So the idea is that the project is able to be financed on the basis of that steady revenue stream that will last for 20 or 25 years. But thereafter, the project continues operating, just not under that contract. We would sell power to the grid on the spot market, just like any other resource could do, and can do that for as long as the wind farm lasts. With regard to replacing components, repowering is always a potential option. Upsizing the wind turbine to catch up with latest technology is an option, although there is quite a bit of turbine specific design that goes into the foundation components. Sure. And then as for decommissioning, there's a vessel that would go out there, would deconstruct, take the components back for recycling or scrap, and the foundation will be removed from the water column, will be taken out of the water. So it's not as though you take off the wind turbine and leave the foundation. The foundation is also removed at the end of the wind turbine's life. Offshore wind is a fairly young industry, so there's not many cases where wind farms have already been decommissioned. But there is a very, very early offshore wind farm in Copenhagen Bay in Denmark, which is 10 2-megawatt turbines instead of 62 13-megawatt turbines. And that project has been around for more than 25 years and was just extended for another 15 years. So we're generally conservative in our estimates around how long these projects will last and be able to produce power, but there's always the opportunity for repowering and then ultimate decommissioning.
Yeah, I mean, given what we're up against with respect to climate change, it's hard to imagine a scenario where we would opt in 30, 35 years to not use foundations for ongoing generation if possible. I mean, I'm sure it's locally specific. Someone asked a question, and I'm sure you get this a lot, but we might as well just have it as part of our recording. Elizabeth asked, what about bird deaths? And I know there's a lot of data out there. I will just cue this up for you. I believe that cats and buildings kill way more birds than wind turbines do on an annual basis, but that is a legitimate concern and question that you hear here in New England. I know some of the sites that were selected and put up for auction were chosen to avoid bird migration pathways. At least that's my understanding.
No, that's right. So I'm not an environmental scientist. I'm an engineer that now works in a commercial function. So I'm not an expert in this area. But all the lease areas that are auctioned by BOEM are down selected for these very types of concerns, right? They're looking at whale presence, whale feeding, are whales in the area during specific times of year where we'd want to be constructing or installing. And they look at bird migration as well. We're quite far offshore, right? 15, 25 miles. So there's not, significant presence of birds in that space. I can't speak to the bird deaths, but it's not been something that's been a major source of concern or sort of negative impact for the offshore wind industry from my experience. In the onshore space, I think that is more of a concern because you do have wind farms developed in places where there are, endangered bird species that we want to, be taking care of.
I'd like to pick up on that. You had mentioned a number of reasons people were disliked offshore wind. You mentioned the fisheries, the whales, and now talk about the birds, and you addressed these. So why all the stop work orders? Why all the pulling of the permits? What is the reason that the federal government is giving for these what seem like drastic measures?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's one, of course, we ask ourselves every day: why is this happening? I think what it comes down to is our president has a personal vendetta against offshore wind. I'm not being sort of sensational when I say that. We know that his staff are not as convicted on this topic as he is. We meet with them, obviously. We spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. these days advocating for offshore wind as a strong component of a portfolio of projects that help us decarbonize and help us meet all of the economic development ambitions that this country has. Yeah, Donald Trump developed an offshore he didn't build an offshore wind farm. He built a golf course in Scotland some many years ago that had an offshore wind farm not far offshore. And from this golf course, those wind turbines were visible. There was a lawsuit filed by President Trump, and he lost. Since that day, he has been very, 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 very against offshore wind in particular, and has fueled a lot of these conspiracy theories about what offshore wind could potentially do, which all the science says is not true, right? It doesn't cause cancer. It doesn't kill whales. It doesn't do these things. We think that that's honestly where it's coming from. Yeah, and it doesn't give us satisfaction to say that.
Yeah. And you mentioned there are new processes recently being put in place for any new wind or solar developments. I was wondering, are there same processes in place for new gas, coal, or oil power plants? Do you know?
So the president has made it clear, right, that he wants to support oil and gas generation in this country. At the time that he's been sort of challenging or trying to revoke federal permits that were gained over years of engagement with BOEM in order to be granted permits to build in the offshore space. He's trying to reduce the same timelines for permitting offshore oil drilling to a few weeks. So it's gotten more difficult for us, and it's gotten much more easy for oil and gas extractors. I think now what we're seeing is you do see some change in approach from even northeastern states around what our energy mix is going to be, and there's an increased discussion of pipelines and natural gas generation. And I think that will come, and that's not all bad. We do see a need to keep the power on, and if there's not offshore wind because of these even unfounded reasons, we do need new generation. But it's gotten much easier for pipelines, for oil and gas extractors, and for the developers and consumers of fossil fuels in producing new energy.
Yeah, I do believe the Empire Wind project was finally greenlighted after Governor Hochul of New York agreed to a gas pipeline infrastructure project across the state.
So we can only speculate on that, what the conversation might have been between Equinor, Governor Hochul, and President Trump on that topic. We know that he was quite keen on this Williams pipeline getting its water permit, clean water permit from New York, which had been something that was withheld by New York for many years. And there was sort of an assumption of a quid pro quo trade there between Equinor, and obviously Equinor as a major oil and gas player as well does have a big stake in the U.S. energy economy outside offshore wind. It does seem like there was something there, although Governor Hochul denies it. Although last week or the week prior, they did ultimately receive that clean water permit, and that project is now moving ahead. So there will be new pipelines in the Northeast as a result of all this.
Yeah.
So Barbara asked about, are other countries facing the same headwinds you know about? And I was adding on to that. I was wondering about, in particular, our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. I mean, is there some possibility that Canada, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland are sort of pick up the slack?
Yeah. So I've actually spent maybe a 10% or 20% of my time since entering offshore wind on the Canadian market. Canada does not have offshore wind today and does not have any seabed leased for the purposes of offshore wind development today. However, I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia last week because they do have a conference going on to sort of kick off their offshore wind program. Premier Houston of Nova Scotia has been super bullish on the offshore wind potential of Nova Scotia, and it is great. It appears from our early technical studies that the wind resource is even better. So, 10 meters per second average wind speed nine and a half meters per second wind speed in New England offshore waters, compared to maybe 10 or 10 and a half meters per second in Nova Scotia. So the wind resource is very strong. The water is also quite shallow. So there's technical potential for 40 or maybe even 60 gigawatts of offshore wind in Nova Scotia. The challenge will be, where does that power go? Because there are not large load centers in Atlantic Canada. The entire consumption of the Nova Scotia economy at its peak is around 2 gigawatts. So the power needs to go to a customer who's willing to pay for it and has that need. Could it be New England? Potentially. Although we would say the resources we have in New England will be built out sooner than those coming from Canada, even with this Trump delay that we're facing. Really, what the Premier of Nova Scotia, Premier Houston, is advocating for right now is that transmission be built to bring offshore wind power from Nova Scotia to Quebec. Quebec does have a forecasted need for about 15 gigawatts of new clean energy by 2040, and it could come from Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia is undergoing a seabed tendering process right now, which is expected to conclude next year. And then there will be, a period of contracting with Hydro-Quebec, and obviously the need to build out the transmission itself. So it's early days for the Canadian market, but it's there. Other big offshore wind markets in the world that I've mentioned. So the birthplace of offshore wind is Denmark. Denmark has several large-scale offshore wind projects previously built, and they have plans to auction off more seabed next year. Germany has quite a few projects. The Netherlands has a significant number of projects, but the biggest offshore wind market is in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is now on its 7th auction round. So there's a lot of seabed off of Scotland and off of England that is very suitable for offshore wind. And the North Sea in general, all of those Scandinavian, Western European, and the United Kingdom, all those countries have offshore wind targets to build out gigawatts and gigawatts. And that's really where the supply chain has been developed to date, and where a lot of the technical expertise still resides. We're obviously funded by Danish investors for a reason. And then
what about the Pacific Rim countries? Are you familiar in particular?
Yeah. So Asia is also a big market for us. Taiwan has been very, very bullish on offshore wind and has been successful in attracting quite a bit of supply chain. So if you want to build offshore wind in Taiwan, you're subject to significant local content requirements. And so they've been able to localize factories for the building of offshore wind. We have two projects that are already operational in Taiwan of a few hundred megawatts. They're taking the approach of buying sort of smaller projects, but they have quite a few of them. They don't have a lot of good onshore alternatives to offshore wind in Taiwan specifically, but they're building out gigawatts of offshore wind as well. Korea is a big market, which is already starting to build, but also has big ambitions for the future. Some fixed bottom, some floating. There's offshore wind in China, although we don't participate in that market. And other sort of burgeoning offshore wind markets include the Philippines and Australia. There's not much that's happened to date in South America, although we did participate in a tender for Colombia recently. So this is a global industry with a few big hubs of activity. I would say the North Sea is number one. Number two is probably Taiwan and Southeast Asia. And then number three is the Northeast United States.
Okay. Certainly we hope it continues that way. And does provide a larger percentage of our power needs. As you said, we have ambitious goals, and it seems like we're using more electricity, not less, in spite of all of our attempts to, insulate and conserve and all that. So we're going to continue to need more electricity. And a lot of people like myself have gotten rid of our gas furnaces and use heat pumps now. And we have our, electric cars, and we use AI, so the demand is great.
It is indeed. It is.
Well, want to be very respectful of your time here. Thank you so much for sharing your information and your experiences. I did want to say that we have another program coming up and announce it here before everybody drops off on December 16th at 7 p.m. Emily Norton from the Charles River Watershed Association is going to be talking about the MWRA proposal for continuing to put sewerage into our rivers and streams, and there was an attempt to sort of try to figure out an alternative strategy. Now, that's all been postponed, but a lot of organizations are concerned about the raw sewerage being dumped into our rivers and streams in periods of high rain, which we may experience more and more of. So that's December 16th at 7 p.m. So once again, Zach, I want to say thank you very much for taking time. Boy, you have a thorny, difficult, complex job, it sounds like. And that's just the political part. You must make an interesting conversationalist at cocktail parties. You have many stories to tell, I'm sure.
Well, I think there's hope for the future. This industry, like I said, the value proposition hasn't changed. Our state partners are saying that, and we believe that these are long-term development assets, and that's how we view them. We're not walking away. Some of our competitors have been forced to do that, but we're not walking away, and we still believe in a future where offshore wind is a big part of the resource mix and helps us reach our climate goals and keep our economy thriving. So,
yep. And a lot of us are getting concerned about the 4-year whiplash we may be facing here. You know, we need a little bit of consistency in these projects, which really have a very long timeline.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. And remember, you can always go to metrowestclimatesolutions.org to watch this video. We recorded it, and as well as previous sessions. And you can sign up for our newsletter at that point. Once a month, we send out a e-news announcing the next program. Thank you very much, and good night.